Good day, Pastor Will here for May 30th, 2021. The text today comes out of Matthew 8, verses 23 through 27. This is part 18 of our series, Better Know a Miracle. And this text today will look at the raging storm at sea and Jesus calming the sea. For our prayers today, I'd like to remember my oldest son, Ash. Today is his birthday. Happy birthday, Ash. I hope you have a good day and a great year. I know you all have individual prayers, and we have prayers as a community, as the Christian community, each of us, that the world come to know that God loves them, and that they come to know that through our own actions. So my prayer for us today is that we be loving in the world, in the way we spend our money, and in the way we solve problems. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. We're looking at Matthew 8, verses 23 through 27. This little pericope starts with verse 8 with Jesus' command. He's talking to people and he commands the disciples, let us go to the other side. And the story ends with when they reach the other side. And in between, there's a raging storm. So in verse 19 of this text, after Jesus says, let's go to the other side, in verse 19, a scribe stands up and says he'll follow Jesus wherever Jesus goes. And this scribe, although maybe sincere, obviously doesn't know what he's saying. And a lot of us are that way. A lot of us don't understand what it means to follow Jesus. We only look at typically only one aspect, but we don't look at what it really means to be a Christian and to be a disciple of Christ. Now we know from the text that the scribe is not one of Jesus's inner circle. He's not a part of his community because he addresses it's not just, I read where some guy said, we can tell he's not a part of the community of Jesus because he addresses Jesus as a rabbi, as teacher. And this guy said no disciple of Jesus would address Jesus as rabbi because they all addressed him as Lord. But that's a very limited view because we know that Mary, when she encounters Jesus at the tomb, calls him rabbi or teacher. And I believe that Mary was a disciple of Jesus just as I am and you are. We can't limit it to just a handful of men. But anyway, the real reason we can see that he isn't a part of the community is because he comes to Jesus and he initiates discipleship. He says, hey, I'm applying for discipleship. I want to be one of your disciples. I want to follow you wherever you go. And in the Gospels, Jesus always initiates discipleship. Jesus always makes the call and invites people to discipleship. We don't invite ourselves to discipleship. The normal way in Jesus' day to align oneself or to learn from a teacher was to apply and then become their student. But Jesus doesn't do things the normal way. The initiative is always with Jesus. And again, this goes back, I've mentioned this before, I'm always suspicious of those people who say, I want to be a pastor or I want to be a missionary or something like that. No one in their right mind wants to be a pastor. No one. What's your motive? If you want to be a pastor, what's your motive? Because it's not an easy road at all. We don't know the scribe's motive. Like I said, he could have been very sincere. I believe he was sincere. But I do believe he didn't understand what he was saying. So then in verse 20, Jesus' response challenges the scribe's idea of what it means to follow Jesus. And Jesus basically says, if you're going to follow me, you're not going to have a normal life. You won't have a place to lay your head. You won't have a home. You'll live by different standards than all the world says is normal. So, learning to follow Jesus or learning that following Jesus requires our living in a way contrary to all community standards is not just a lesson for people who are new to Jesus, like the scribe, but also for us who are already disciples. And we see that in the next thing that happens with someone who is already a disciple of Jesus, already a follower or a student of Jesus. In verse 21, it says, another of Jesus's disciples says he will follow Jesus, but first he has to bury his father. Okay. And Jesus' response, Jesus was very pastoral in his response, and what we expect of pastors today to be, and said, okay, it's okay. Go and bury your father and tend to your matters at home. And when you decide you're ready, you come and follow me. Of course, that's not how Jesus reacts. Jesus says, let the dead bury the dead and come and follow me. This is a bit harsh. It's shocking to hear. Jesus? Yes. You know, and I've seen people try to make the statement not so harsh. Jesus couldn't have been that harsh. He didn't really mean that. You know, you need to interpret it this way, Will. The disciple was going to be going indefinitely because he was still, you know, honoring his father who was still alive. And one day his dad would die and he would have to bury his father and then settle the estate. And then when he was ready, he could come and follow Jesus. That's one interpretation. And it's not a bad interpretation because it's the way we do things today in a lot of ways. We say, well, I'll follow Jesus after I make a lot of money and then I can do it. Things like that, you know. Or I'll follow Jesus on my deathbed after I've lived the life the way I want to live it. That kind of thing. But that's not what it means in this text. Another way we try to interpret it is to spiritualize it. We say, well, he's talking spiritually. Let the spiritually dead bury the dead. And that's not how it's meant here either. And it's funny how we like to spiritualize things to make them not real. It's why we prefer a spiritual God or a spiritual Jesus or a spiritual religion, because it's just not real. We can do whatever the hell we want. In fact, in this text, the disciple means exactly what he says. I need to bury my father. The tradition of the day was when someone died, you buried them that day. He had to bury his father, and this is a reasonable and legitimate reason, not an excuse, a reason why he couldn't follow Jesus into the boat that day and go to the other side. And it's why Jesus' words seem very harsh. They're shocking, scandalous words. And that's what the text is doing. It's getting our attention. It's calling us to rethink what it means to follow Jesus. Even we who are disciples of Jesus, even we who follow Jesus daily already, are always called to rethink what it means to follow Jesus. And to follow Jesus is not going to fall within traditional boundaries or norms. We're always rethinking. Different circumstances require different responses, and there's no certain formula. You know, I've heard in certain traditions that believe that drinking, if you drink alcohol, you're going to hell. If you have any part of alcohol or smoking or dancing, what was it dancing called when I was younger? I can't remember. Playing cards on Sunday, cutting the grass on Sunday. These might be old-fashioned things, but we have all kind of things today. Tell me one. But we often confuse following Jesus with rules, or if we confuse following Jesus with going to church, or we confuse following Jesus with being a church member, or even being a patriot, which following Jesus has nothing to do with any of those things. Nothing. I'm reminded of a time years ago, and I may have shared this with you. I used to do a lot of cycling, and I was cycling out in the country, and I got a flat tire, and it started to rain, and I didn't want to walk home, and I had on bike shoes, and it's hard to walk with those cycling shoes on. And I saw a guy's house, and I stopped at his house to ask him if he could perhaps give me a ride. He had a pickup truck out front, and I knew that this guy had a reputation in the community for being the local drug dealer. The rumor was that he had sold cocaine and other drugs, he and his family, and then the family got busted, and he was the one who took the fall, went to prison for a while and came back, and now he was living the life off of his drug money. And I had heard this rumor, but I didn't really know that it was true. You hear so many rumors, it didn't really matter. I needed a ride home in the rain. So I stopped and I asked him for a ride, and when he answered the door, he was scantily clad, and there was a woman with him, and all that she was wearing was one of those feather boas. He was wearing cowboy boots and a cowboy hat and some underwear, but they both had a certain type of beer in their hands they were drinking. And I could tell he was up to some activities, and I was interrupting, but he still took the time to hear what I had to say, and he stopped what he was doing, and he put on a bathrobe, and he said, meet me at the truck. I put my bike in the truck, and he took me home. That was very gracious of him. especially considering his entertainment at the time. And he acted loving toward me. He acted godlike toward me. And I wondered, how can I repay him? How can I thank him? How can I show God to this man? And I realized, well, he likes a certain kind of beer. I saw a lot of them in his house. So I bought him a case of that kind of beer. And I was able to show God to him. Now, people in the church thought this was scandalous and outrageous. Their pastor is buying beer for the drug dealer and then became his friend. You know, being a disciple of Christ means doing things very differently from what the mores of a society are, or of a community, a church, whatever how you want to define it. Some years ago, I was at a church, and this church had a bunch of members in it who were especially vile and despicable and cowardly and evil. And they would constantly harass us and drive by the parsonage constantly, and they were stalking us, and they would stalk my wife and follow her around and say things to her that were cruel and mean. And they would do the same to me in town, and they were just vicious people. And one day they did something, I don't remember what they did. It was particularly upsetting, especially to Jennifer, my dear wife. And she just started crying uncontrollably and wondering, why are these people so mean to us? I don't understand. And I was enraged that my wife was so hurt by these cruel people. And so I recorded her on my phone. I recorded her anguish. And then I sent a group video to the whole congregation so they could all see what was going on. And I demanded on that video, you know, what's going to happen? Why is this allowed to continue? A lot of people in the congregation said I shouldn't have sent that video. Some of my really well-meaning friends in the congregation chastised me for sending the video, and they told me it was unwise. And of course I knew it was unwise when I sent it. But wisdom, that kind of wisdom of the cultural norm, was not my motivation for sending it. My motivation for sending it was because I believe the call to discipleship is always done in community, and the community as a whole, the community of Christ, is responsible for each other. And how can the community be responsible for each other if they don't know what's going on? And I wanted to share that and give them opportunity to rise to discipleship instead of just being critical or being ignorant of what's going on or being aware of what's going on and turning their eyes away, which is what the majority of the people did. One guy, of course, called the police on me, alleging that I was abusing Jennifer. And the police came and paid us a visit. You know, just meanness. But being a disciple of Jesus means doing things differently than normal expectations in a society. It can mean being and acting in very scandalous ways. Following Jesus, taking up that cross and following Jesus is always a scandalous affair. You can't just blend in with the rest of the community and be unnoticed. So Jesus tells his disciples, follow me, let's get in the boat and go to the other side. And the other side was the place of the Gentiles. And so they all get into the boat and they begin their journey to the other side, to a place they normally wouldn't go. The Jewish people avoided the Gentiles. You don't go to the land of the Gentiles. They were different. They were considered ungodly. Jesus says, that's where we're headed. Get in the boat if you're going to be with me, and let's go. And they get in the boat. And in Matthew's gospel, a boat symbolizes the church and the journey that the church is making. And all that happens to that boat is what symbolizes what's happening to the church in Matthew's time. So the disciples following Jesus into the boat, for Matthew and his community, symbolizes what it means to be the church and what we can expect as the church when we're following Jesus. Now, there was a fellow, he's a dear friend of mine, I love him, a great gift from God to me. And he was a member of one of my churches, and he always used the analogy of a ship being the church. And all the congregation is on the ship together, and they're all working together, and they have different jobs. Some of them work the sails, and some of them swab the decks, and some of them cook the meals, and they're all working together so that the ship can get to its destination. And in his analogy, the pastor was at the rudder or the helm guiding the ship. And I loved his analogy. I thought it was great but I always disagreed that the pastor was guiding the ship. It's a sailing vessel for a reason. In this analogy, I would say to him, and the pastor perhaps is a guide, maybe a navigator in the analogy, and tries to guide the people. But the ship is steered not by the pastor at the rudder, but by the Spirit of God blowing the sails and directing the ship where it needs to go. And the people just need to, maintain things so that God can do that, so the Spirit can do that. And the people need to be in touch with the Spirit so the Spirit can do that. So I can identify with Matthew's symbology. So Matthew's story is relating that the church is called to follow Jesus wherever Jesus goes. And by Jesus commanding that they all go to the other side, we see the church and disciples are called to go to new places they would never consider going on their own. In fact, they would avoid the places where Jesus calls us to go, to the hungry and the poor and the smelly, to our enemies, these kind of places. This is where Jesus calls us to go, and this is where Jesus is. And if we're not with those kind of people, if we're not in those uncomfortable places, we're not with Jesus. We know that the other side of the Sea of Galilee, the eastern shore, was a place of the Gentiles, and we know it in the story because Matthew pushes the story even further in verse 30 of chapter 8 by saying when they get to the other side, they see a big herd of swine, a bunch of pigs. And the Jewish people wouldn't have a herd of pigs. Pigs were unclean. So we know we're in an uncomfortable place. But along the way to the other side, the church along the way to uncomfortable places, the church will encounter terrifying or terrific storms. This boat that the disciples are in finds itself in a terrific, incredible storm. Matthew uses the term seismic. It's an earthquake. It's the mother of all storms. And this storm doesn't represent the storms of life of an individual. No, the storm represents the reality of people who follow Jesus. The reality of disciples of Jesus is that life can be tough. It will be tough. There will be storms. There will be hard times. It will be rough. It will be rough because everything the disciple of Jesus does is different from what the rest of the community expects, whether that community is a family unit or a neighborhood or a state or a nation or the world. The disciple of Jesus is in tune with the beat of a different drummer. The disciple of Jesus is focused on what God wants and not on anything else. So whatever the rest of the world considers normal or good may not be what God considers normal or good. For instance, and this is my old standby because it's always easy to work with, when a nation calls us to kill our enemies and God says, no, you're supposed to love your enemies. And so those who refuse to go and kill our enemies because they obey God instead and they seek the authority of God instead, their community will ostracize them and ridicule them, maybe imprison them, hurt them, say that they're cowards and all manner of things. Those kind of things. So, to be a disciple of Jesus, one can expect to be ostracized and alienated and to endure hardships because of their faith. Because faith in Jesus, faith in God, is counterculture. It's different than the cultures in which we live. Our culture says it's okay, and not only okay, honorable and expected to kill people. Jesus says no, it's never honorable. Never. And so this is the opposite popular teaching we see in this story of the stilling of the storm. It's the opposite popular teaching that you hear in a lot of places. You hear in pop culture. You hear in churches that are just liars, that says that if you follow Jesus and if you accept Jesus into your life life will be peachy and great with no problems. That's a lie. And if you're going along with this, then you're not following Jesus. Some years ago, I was deep sea fishing off the coast of Savannah. We were out beyond, we couldn't see the land. And then it was in a small boat, just 26 feet, and didn't seem that small until we got on the radio. We got a call, a small craft advisory from the Coast Guard, in which there were going to be waves that might be perilous to us. And I didn't think much of it until I noticed the waves were actually higher than our bow and higher than our stern, and the captain was skillfully navigating us through the waves, and I could see the waves following us. They wanted to crash on us, but the captain was very skillful, and she got us safely back to shore. And I was very, very appreciative of her. But how would I have reacted if during this tempest or these high waves or rough waves, if she had been like, it's no big deal, I'm going to take a nap while you guys do the best you can. This raging storm hits. The disciples are terrified. They don't know what to do, and Jesus is asleep in the boat, and they go to him and they wake him up and say, don't you care about us? Don't you realize we're near death? We're going to capsize. The waves are going to crash upon us and break us to pieces. We're going to drown. We're going to die. It's going to be horrible. Do you not care? If only the church today would act with such faith. Jesus says they have little faith, but at least they have some. They have inadequate faith, but at least they have some. They come to Jesus and they express themselves. They talk with him. It's okay to talk with God, even to complain to God. It's okay to accuse God of not caring. It's all okay, because at least you're still communicating with God. We're still saying, hey, can't you do something? God doesn't hold that against us, our complaints and our worries. Most people just blame God for abandoning them, and so they abandon ship themselves, and they leap over the side of the ship and into the sea to be carried somewhere else. In my example above, in which I talked about a church where I'd made that video of my wife in distress, severe distress, it's too bad so many people abandoned that ship. If only they would have stayed and asked God, how do we handle this? What will you do? Instead of insisting on handling it our own way and abandoning ship. In the individual Christian's life, so often when we find ourselves in a storm, we become angry with God for putting us there and not caring about us or not helping us, when that's not the case at all. We're just journeying with God. God's right there with us. Even going all the way back into the Old Testament, God says, we're told, even though we might travel through the valley of the shadow of death, we don't have to fear, because God is with us. God's been making the journey with us. Many of you know that I'm terrified of flying, and that years ago when I was younger, I took flying lessons and all that to try to overcome that fear, and it didn't work. And I avoid flying at all costs. But one time I had to fly somewhere, and we were flying at night. It was a very small plane. I was sitting right behind the pilot and co-pilot. There was no door. It was a tiny plane. There was a curtain, and they had the curtain open, and I could hear what was going on. And way in the distance in the direction we were flying, it was at night, as I said, I could see lightning. And so I looked on their radar, and I said, is that a storm up ahead? And they said, yes, it's a storm. It's a pretty bad storm. And I said, well, what are you going to do? Can this plane fly over that? Because we're headed right toward it. Can we go that high and get above the storm? What are you going to do? And they were kind, and they talked to me, and they said, no, we can't fly above that storm. So what we're going to do, and I was just terrified they were going to say, we're going to just go right through it. But they said, we're going to avoid it. It's going to make the flight a little longer. We're going to be a little late, but we're not going to go through that storm. We're going to go around it. And I was overjoyed. It was a wonderful, smooth flight, just great. That's what we tend to think we're going to get when we become disciples of Jesus. But that's not true. We're going to be going right through the storms. It's going to be a bumpy ride. It's going to be frightening at times. We aren't guaranteed smooth sailing when we follow Jesus. In fact, we're guaranteed anything but that. If your life is one of smooth sailing with no problems, you might want to ask yourself who you're following. Being in storms is a guarantee when we get into the boat with Jesus. And if our goal is to avoid storms and have smooth sailing, we don't need to get into the boat with Jesus. We don't need to follow Jesus. For some reason, we have this idea that following Jesus means our lives will be perfect and without conflict and they'll be financially prosperous. Jesus never promises any of that. He promises the opposite of that. He just told the scribe, I won't even have a home. You know, if you follow me, you won't even have a home. You know, things are going to be a lot different. Verse 26, Jesus' response to the frightened disciples is, why are you so frightened, you of little faith? I talked about that a while ago, but I want to say a little bit more about it. Little faith in that they falter at a critical time, at a moment of crisis, a moment of chaos. Now, as you know, to be in crisis is to be in a moment of decision. It's a moment to decide. You know, how will we react in a crisis? How will we act? What will we do? So crisis is a moment of opportunity, a moment of decision. Will we continue to trust Jesus? Well, the disciples did. They called on him, help us. And he did. Or will we take things into our own hand and maybe grab the rudder or jump overboard? You know, we forget that it's out of chaos that God created the whole world, and that God is the authority over all chaos and over crisis. Jesus calms the storm in response to his disciples' cry of fear. He loves them. He didn't want them to be upset. He didn't want them to be afraid. He was asleep because he trusted that God was with him. If only they had trusted it, maybe they would have gotten a nice little nap too before getting to the other side. And he calms the storm, and the question arises, what kind of man is this? And we see, well, this is a man who has authority over chaos. This is a man who makes worlds out of chaos. This is a man who steals chaos and unruliness. This is a man who steals violence, a man of peace, a man not of violence. And so we learn through this story, this miracle of Jesus calming the sea, that to follow Jesus isn't to add another worthy obligation to our list of things to do. But to follow Jesus is to enter into a shocking, scandalous relationship with God in which everything we do is different from what the world expects. And to follow Jesus doesn't mean that we may have days outside of our comfort zone. It means that our destination and our journey are outside of our comfort zones. Our whole life is outside of our comfort zone, outside of what our society tells us is the right thing or normal way to live. We no longer live according to societal expectations. We no longer live according to traditional expectations. Whether those expectations are in the church or out of it. But we live like Jesus, which means we're in for a heck of a ride. So, you know, at the end of the story, we don't know whether the scribe and the disciple who had to bury his dad stayed safely on the shore in a familiar place, or whether they got into the boat and buckled up for the ride with Christ. We don't know. And that's the same question that we're left with for ourselves. Will we stay safely on the shore that we're familiar with, or will we dare to be faithful and get into the boat with Jesus and trust him wherever we go? That's the question for each of us. May you all know the love and blessings of Jesus in your own lives. Amen.